My name is Jordan Beattie, and I'm here to talk to you about mandatory minimum sentencing in the justice system. How many of you have personally been affected by having a family member or a friend incarcerated at one point or another? Many of us have not had a direct family member incarcerated, and it can be considered a taboo topic. However, you might have a friend who is struggling with this and be completely unaware. A study in 2020 concluded that actually half of Americans have had a family member that has been in jail or in prison. That same study actually concluded that 1 in 4 adult Americans have had a sibling incarcerated, and furthermore, 1 in 5 adults have had a parent who's been incarcerated in jail or prison. And out of all the inmates in the Bureau of Prisons custody, 55.7% of all those inmates are products of mandatory minimum sentencing. So the prison system is constantly overcrowded. Despite this, however, there are many offenders that are carrying overly long, harsh sentences, which contribute to this issue greatly. Mandatory minimums are also notorious for disproportionately affecting poor minorities as well. So currently, all 50 states and Washington, D.C. have some kind of mandatory minimum sentencing laws in place. There are federal laws regarding this as well. Mandatory minimums for federal drug offenses were actually created in 1986 by Congress and also 1988. And in 2012, 260,000 people received a mandatory sentencing for a federal drug offense. Each state's legislature creates their own varying sentences, and most mandatory minimums are for drug or gun crimes. Legislators originally believed these sentences would act as a deterrence to others who were committing the same crimes. There was also a belief that this would help control judicial discretion as well. Ultimately, though, the end goal was to send a message per se that they were taking a stand against crime. Going back to my earlier point, mandatory minimums notoriously affect poor minorities. 67.7% of Black and 57.1% of Hispanic defendants received sentences at or above the mandatory minimum rate in comparison to their white counterparts, which was at 54%. More Hispanics and less whites were initially indicted at the mandatory minimum level for the same crime, and whites were also more likely to plead guilty and avoid conviction at the mandatory threshold. Men are also more likely to be sentenced with these harsh guidelines than women. However, there are organizations and individuals out there that are fighting against these unjust sentencing laws. FAM, which stands for Families Against Mandatory Minimums, is an organization that challenges mandatory sentencing laws and advocates for criminal justice reform. They actually formed in 1991. Julie Stewart, the founder, founded the organization after her brother was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison without parole. This was for his very first charge, and it was for growing marijuana in the state of Washington. They have succeeded in enactment of federal legislation to reform sentencing, such as the Fair Sentencing Act. They have also been successful at repealing and/or reforming drug mandatory minimum sentences in multiple states, including Michigan, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Georgia, Iowa, and many more. There are also lawmakers who are actively working to end mandatory sentencing nationwide. In 2021, the Smarter Sentencing Act was reintroduced by U.S. Senators Dick Durbin and Mike Lee. This wouldn't necessarily eliminate federal mandatory minimum sentences for drug charges, but it would reduce them. And President Biden also urged federal prosecutors in January of 2021 to use discretion in these decisions as well. He also rescinded a policy from the Trump administration that required prosecutors to pursue the most serious charges that were available. We should try and be a part of the fight to go against mandatory minimums as well. Studies tend to show that incarceration has the potential to touch any life out there. And as mentioned above, 1 in 5 Americans have a parent who is incarcerated at one time or another. We are not immune to it. Neither are our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, our friends. They haven't proven to be effective. Mandatory minimums have not proven to deter crimes. Studies actually showed that most criminals are unaware of the maximum penalty that their crime might hold when they are committing said crime. They don't increase sentence uniformity like most would think that they would, because different legislations use them in varying times. And legislators have shown us that deterrence is possible and more likely in states where alternatives are used. So abolishing mandatory minimums in the United States would be beneficial for the justice system in many, many ways. Multiple organizations are already fighting against these unfair sentencing laws. Some states have slightly reformed these laws, period. However, none have abolished them altogether. These states include Arkansas, California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and many more. Specifically, Louisiana enacted 3 new prison reform laws in May of 2012, including one that gave prosecutors discretion to waive mandatory minimum prison terms for nonviolent, non-sex offenses. Even if mandatory minimums were abolished at a federal level, however, states would still have the discretion to create and enforce their own laws. Getting rid of mandatory sentencing laws, though, would help the justice system because judges might feel like their hands are tied. Despite personal circumstances to a case or a crime, they tend to have to sentence a certain way due to those sentencing laws. And removing discretion from the judges shifts it towards the police and the prosecution. There's little evidence that the sentencing laws reduce crime or deters criminals. It adds to prison overcrowding and is expensive to house an abundance of prisoners for longer than reasonable, and it weakens communities and families, which may actually lead to an increase in crime. So while this isn't a topic that may touch you directly, that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't one day in the future, which is why we should actively work together to abolish or at least reform mandatory sentencing laws at the very least. Thank you for listening.